Principal Madam, Dr. Supriya Shidhe, Convener and Coordinator, IQAC Coordinator, Dr. Rajeshri Hirlekar, Co-Coordinator, Dr. Anita Aire, Organizing Committee Coordinator, Organizing Committee Members, today's resource person, Dr. Abhishek Chitnis, and dear participants. On behalf of Vivekanand Education Society's College of Pharmacy, Mumbai, I, Dr. Aparna Palshetkar, Assistant Professor from Pharmaceutics Department, welcome you all on day 5 of AICTE sponsored ATAL 1 week online and 1 week offline faculty development program on research and innovation ecosystem in academics need of the hour. Before we begin with the session, let me introduce today's resource person, Dr. Abhishek Chitnis. Dr. Abhishek Chitnis is professionally trained in health economics and outcomes research with over 15 years of experience in observational research and real world data. Sir is a pharmaceutical sciences graduate who has completed his master's in quality assurance from the University of Mumbai and his PhD in pharmaceutical health outcomes and policy from the University of Houston. Sir is having 45 publications in various national and international journals with 124 presentations presented in international conferences till date to his credit. Dr. Abhishek Chitnis has worked within the pharmaceutical industry, such as Johnson & Johnson, Evidera, formerly part of United Biosource Corporation, Biogen, Massachusetts, in which key positions and roles throughout his distinguished career. Presently, Sir is working in Biogen, Massachusetts, as a global health, economics, and outcomes research lead neuropsychiatry, value, and assess. Dr. Abhishek Chitnis is affiliated as a member of the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research and a member of the graduate students and alumni of Pharmacy Administration of the University of Houston. With this brief introduction, I request Sir to start with his presentation and share his expert opinion on improving outcomes with real-world evidence and health economics and outcomes research.
Thank you, Dr. Palshetkar. It's really an honor, and I really feel proud to be talking to all the faculty here. First of all, before I begin with my presentation, I would sincerely like to thank Dr. Supriya Shidhe for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to present to you the field of health economics and outcomes research. Also, it would not be fair if I do not thank Dr. Hirlekar ma'am, Dr. Aire ma'am, and Dr. Jadhav ma'am for helping me and coordinating with me in spite of my delays, getting them the presentation or the request that they wanted. I was so busy that I got delayed in sending things. So thank you for all your patience and giving me this opportunity to talk in front of you. So before I begin with my talk, what I'm going to be asking you is, instead of going with a formal 2-hour session where I just keep on talking about things and then giving just the half hour for interactions, maybe I may open this session for to be an interactive session while I am talking, because I understand that the HEOR is not a core part of our pharmacy curriculum. And as I was talking with Jadhav ma'am just before this session, that HEOR may be a part of pharmacy practice, but is not something that has been taught extensively in the pharmacy career, or for that matter, real world evidence. So maybe, it would be helpful for all of us so that we are at the same platform, and I understand that whatever concepts or whatever examples that I'm providing to you, we all are understanding and we all are on the same page. So with this, what I'm going to be doing today is HEOR RWE, which is real world evidence. It's such a broad field, and it wouldn't be justice for from my side to get everything together, on one place in just these 2.5 hours in front of you. So what I'm going to do is for today is going to give you a high level, a bird's eye view about what exactly does HEOR or what is RWE doing, and what does a HEOR team here at Biogen or Johnson and Johnson or at a consulting firm do. So I'll be providing you with a lot of examples that we do in our day-to-day life, a lot of studies that we do in order to get the product to the market, or if the product is in the market, then how do we want to get it to the top tier? How do we want to make sure that the product is a success? So with this said, this is my disclaimer. And so the agenda for today's topic is going to be where I simply talk about what do we mean by real world data? What do we mean by real world evidence? And then go into what is HEOR? Why is it required? Then go on to a concept which is called as a value demonstration strategy that this HEOR and RWE fall under, and we as HEOR professionals have to do that strategy in order to make decisions. So under these value demonstration strategy, which falls under HEOR or from the HEOR perspective, what are the key components that we would be looking at, which would be the burden of illness, the unmet needs, the clinical value, economic and humanistic value. And then I am going to be shifting gears a bit and then talking about future of the real world evidence with respect to medical devices, not just drugs, but with respect to medical devices. And why I included this, because I saw that, in the trust areas of interest was something where we where of interest was robotics, internet of things, artificial intelligence, and that's where the medical device industry is getting into and is using RWE to help get the level where it wants it to be. So before I go into the start of the session, I would just want to gauge and see if anyone has any questions. Okay. So then we begin with a simple thing like real world data. And it's not that we do not understand what a real world data is. But today as well in Biogen, when I'm talking with folks from medical side, so we have a team from medical affairs, clinical affairs. And when I'm talking with them, they are the ones that they sometimes do not even understand what real world evidence or real world data is. So that's where I want to make sure that we are all at the same level, at the same field when we talk about real world data. So real world data means that it's a data that it's the data that's collected from anything, any area of daily life, which is not obtained from our randomized control trials. So we have randomized control trial as one thing, and then everything else that falls would be majorly real world data that comes from the daily life. So for example, when we are talking about what are the sources of it? So for the first one that I list is the electronic health records. So when I say electronic health records, what do they mean? So for example, when we go to these hospitals, uh, anything that they record in their system that forms a part of the health records that could be available in order to do any kind of future studies. The second thing is with the claims and the billing activities. Everyone in the US, you are supposed to have insurance, health insurance. India, the trend is changing as well. Everyone right now, the working class does have health insurance. So what claims we submit, or whenever we go to a healthcare facility, or when we reach out to healthcare professionals, the data that is submitted, the claims that are submitted to the insurance, that is forms a really good basis for doing any kind of studies or analysis. And these two, basically, if you can imagine the health records and the claims analysis, imagine the number of hospitals that are there and the number of claims or the insurances that are there. How much data will be generated from that? So this forms nothing but big data. So when people are talking about big data, it is nothing but such sources like health records, claims analysis, or any other public data from where I talk about the last point, anything that's patient generated data in the home use setting. So, which could be anything like the wearables that we have, like Fitbit, or uh, a- any such instrument that conveys, or the apps that transmits the information to a system, forms a part of this real world data. And then there is something which is the product and the disease registries. So when we talk about registries, registries are a place where after the drug is released, or if a sponsor wants to conduct a study using specific age group of patients, they can enroll those patients and study those patients for a particular period of time, and that would be a part of the product and the disease registries. And this, again, here you do not control anything, but you just observe things and you monitor things in these registries, and you note the things that are important or useful for you. So I'm going to go to the next slide and then take a pause and see if there are questions. So what is the real world evidence? So any evidence that you get or obtain from the real world data is the real world evidence. So when we are talking about the real world evidence, we are talking about what are the benefits that we would get, what are the potential risks that are associated with a medical product. So these are the main parts of the real world evidence. There are other things that you can note as well in the real from the real world data, which part forms a part of the real world evidence. But mostly for pharmaceuticals, the main thing would be what are the product benefits and what are the product risks. So does it mean that RCTs, or the randomized control trials, are not something that we want to go forward with and we want to just rely on real world evidence? No. RCTs till date are a gold standard in assessing safety and efficacy of the drug. We will be talking about what is the difference between the real world evidence and the uh, randomized control trials as well. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone understands that RCTs would be something that would be a gold standard, but is not the only source when we want to look at the effectiveness and the safety of the drugs. So I'll take a pause here and see if any of you have any questions. Okay, so this
I
is,
have one question, Abhishek.
yes.
When we are talking about sources of real world data, where one of the sources is patient generated data, including home use settings. So, how can you validate this data, and how this data can become reliable when it is not coming from any formal sources?
Right, that's a very good question, Dr. Shide. So basically, that's one of the disadvantages with the real world evidence that we get. So whatever data we get, the data quality management, it becomes an important source. So with randomized control trials, you know that it is a controlled setting, the data is validated, it has gone through several steps. Whereas uh, when you are doing any analysis with patient generated data, or the data that has not been validated, it comes with its own biases, or it comes with its own limitations and drawbacks. So how much reliability or how much confidence we would have on that data is still a question mark. However, that being said, we cannot just ignore that data, because that data can still provide valuable information that could supplement the data or the information that we could get from other sources. So these days, social media also forms not a reliable, but does form a part or an aspect where we can get the data from. But the reliability just on that data is not something that we can guarantee or have full confidence. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, very clear.
Okay, so then we go on to looking at what exactly is the difference between the randomized control trials and the real world evidence. The first, the first definition itself for the randomized control trials and the real world evidence. So whenever we say from a randomized control trial, we get is the efficacy of the drug. How efficacious is the drug? But whatever answers you would get from a real world data or real world evidence, you are never going to use the term efficacy. You have to use the term is the effectiveness. So that's what you have to differentiate between the evidence that you get from RCTs versus RWE. Because in RCTs, you can say causation. So one thing leads to another is the main basis of randomized control trial. In real world evidence, that is very difficult to prove that one thing caused the other thing. You can prove that there is an association between one versus another, but causation is something that you cannot quickly or you cannot 100% guarantee that is available. So what in real world evidence the term we used is effectiveness versus efficacy. The settings, of course, we know is with randomized control trial, it's experimental versus this is real world setting. So when we say real world setting is now I decide that I want to conduct a study on patients that have diabetes. What I do is I approach certain hospitals and tell them that if if I have the patient consent, can I follow first 100 or first 200 patients for diabetes in your record and see what's happening to these patients over certain number of years. So I'm just making those observations, taking their records, and then trying to see, oh, these patients have been using metformin for the first 2 years, but then they switch to sulfonylureas and so on down the path. This is what observational or the real world studies would do. Whereas in the RCTs, as we know, it's an experimental setting. So people are randomized and one gets a drug versus placebo or another standard of care. The next thing is with respect to the follow-up. The follow-up, it's in the actual practice with the real world evidence. Here it is designed. You already know that you want to follow, you would be following these patients for 6 months, for 12 weeks, and so on. The treatment pattern is again fixed with RCT because that's what the investigator has decided before. Whereas with RWE, it would be variable pattern because if, for example, I am following a patient who has diabetes and the patient decides that at home the patient is not going to take the medications, the patient is not compliant, the patient is not adhering to his medication. So the patient skips medication for a week and then goes back. Whereas I would not understand that in the real world evidence settings. There are ways of understanding it, but it is not exactly, we would not be exactly sure. Whereas with this settings in the RCTs, we exactly know what's the pattern. Then the study group that is there, which is in RCTs is homogeneous. That's because of randomization. You randomize the patient, making sure that the patients have similar age groups, similar health conditions when you're looking at the effect of the drug on these patients. whereas in RWE it would be heterogeneous. And when I say heterogeneous is, for example, in the RWE, I want to test two drugs, the effectiveness of two drugs, say drug A and drug B, and I just say that, okay, let me see drug A is effective as compared to drug B, and I find drug A looks really very good. It looks effective as compared to drug B. But there would be a lot of biases in the real world evidence. Maybe the drug A has all healthy patients. If they have younger patients, they have less number of comorbidities, whereas the drug B had older patients. They had more comorbidities. They were more sicker, and that's the reason why the drug B showed to be less effective as compared to drug A. So now with RWE, you cannot just make these conclusions. You want to do some adjustment before you can come to a conclusion. And that's where the HEOR piece comes into play. You want to get everyone at one level. You want to balance and make people at one level. You don't want to compare apples to oranges. If you're going to compare apples to oranges and say that, oh, the apple is different from the orange, of course, you inherently started with different group of people and you are saying one is different than the other. It's not the effect of the drug, but it is the inherent effect of the patient population itself that's showing that difference. So we want to make sure that everyone is at one level when you are doing a RWE research before you can make any conclusions with respect to their effectiveness. The next point is about attending physicians, which would be an investigator here versus the patient may switch practitioners one after another. The patient may go to one physician, may find that the physician is not good, may change it to another. And that may change the way the treatment is provided to the patient. So that has to be accounted for. The comparators in randomized control trial, again, they could be placebo or you have a selective options. With RWE, you can have as many alternatives as possible. So it all depends upon what different alternatives are the patients ready to try and experiment with before anything. So many alternatives are available. The patient monitoring in RCTs is going to be continuous per the protocol, whereas in the RWE, it is changeable. It may not be possible to monitor the patient or get information of the patient if the patient does not visit the healthcare settings. So now, as I said, the RWE is coming from either the insurance settings or from the electronic health records. So this only is recorded when the patient visits a physician. If the patient decides that he doesn't want to go to the physician, it's not going to be recorded. So that's going to be another question mark, or that's going to be another limitation of RWE. I'm going to take a pause because a lot of things that I've said, and I know that most of these might be already, you guys might be already familiar with it, but still want to see is if you have any questions on any of the things that we discussed until now.
Hello.
Yes.
Regarding attending the physician, like when you go for RCT, you may have a set of questions normally, but when you go for RWE, there are chances that the patient may come up with something additional which may not be disclosed in RCT. Is it also possible?
Yes. So that's an advantage of the real world evidence, right? So with the real world evidence, you would get information that would not be available with the randomized control trial. So that's the beauty of real world evidence. That's very correct.
Just one more thought that comes in my mind is that, see, for randomized clinical trials, the data is with you because you are the investigator. But real world evidence, there may be issues, how whether they will share this confidential information, what would be about privacy of data and all such things.
Correct. That is exactly true. So what happens is, so when we do studies here, so we have contracts with these insurance agencies and these big health systems that are providers for electronic health record. So what they do before they provide us the data is uh, they anonymize the patient record. So everything, the patient information is de-identified before it comes to us. So so that it's not traceable back to which patient was whom. And then because of the contract that we have with these insurance agencies or the health system that we have overall, we do get the data, but at the same time they may restrict certain number of variables which they may not want to share with us. So that is going to be a possibility, but most of the things that we would be interested in is provided by these electronic health records or the claims data, and especially those would be related to hospitalizations, emergency room visits, what is happening to these patients in terms of the medication use, and so on. Anything else? Yes.
Got it, got it.
I
I
suppose
think we have one question.
yeah, Aparna madam can just check the question chat box. Rather, I will suggest the participants to raise their hands and they can unmute themselves and ask the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I want to
Please.
ask you.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Sir, I wanted to know, in case of RCDs, for clinical trials, we are giving forms to patients saying that the drug may have adverse reactions or it may affect you, and they have to sign those forms. Otherwise, clinical trial is not a possibility. Do we do the same thing in case of RWE?
No, so that's again one thing. So RWE, you do not have control over what the patient is going to be doing. RWE is something where you do not intervene with what the patient is being prescribed. So you are just observing what is happening and collecting that data. So you are not, giving that intervention purposefully to the patient in terms when you are saying that you are doing RWE. Even when you are reporting or whenever you are doing a registry, what you would do is, for example, if a drug is given, you will collect those patients and record what is happening to the patients that are taking that drug. But you are not the one who would be actually giving that drug or the making that intervention in RW.
Sir, I
Okay,
have
so
one question.
yeah, sure.
Sir, for conducting RCTs, we have a definite amount of populations data which is collected. So in RWE, do we have such criteria that we should have a sufficient amount of population data to be confirming whether the drug is effective?
Yes, so that is a very good point. Definitely. Anything that you do, especially, you need to have a sufficient sample size before you can have that confidence. So whenever you're testing your hypothesis, you need to have enough sample size power so that you have that confidence that your results are what they are supposed to be. Similarly, with RWE, you would require a much larger, or you would have much larger sample size than what you would have with RCTs. But to make your answer clear, yes, sample size is an important portion of RWE as well. And you need to make sure that you are having enough sample size and power in order to make any conclusions.
So could we know what would be the size, the population required, the
Yes,
data?
definitely. Yes. So that again is a part of the training in HEOR and RWE.
Okay.
So whenever we go through whenever, so as a part of our coursework, what the first step when we take the statistics course is what we are taught is how do you calculate that sample size that would be required in order to show that effectiveness that's required. So you have certain calculations for sample size, what kind of power, the confidence interval that you require. So there are tools that would help you understand, and this is based on the differences that you are expecting between the two groups. So for example, if the two groups that you are comparing, you expect them to have a larger difference, then the sample size you require is very small, because the difference itself is so big that a small sample size should be sufficient enough to show that difference. But as the difference between the two groups go on reducing, the sample size that you would require in order to show that difference is statistically significant is going to be more. So you want to follow that and see what your sample size is going to be.
Okay, thank you, sir. There are few questions in the chat box. Sneha Bagle madam is asking, will it be correct to say that RWE is more of post-market survey after the drug has come into the market?
That's again a very good question. So yes, so RWE has been traditionally used as for post-market surveillance. Definitely. So once the RCT is done, once you know that drug is efficacious, you want to see is what happens in the real world. Uh, uh, Real world, what is happening to this drug? Is it having the same effect as what was shown in the RCT? And that's what is the FDA requirement, is that you need to do is the post marketing surveillance. However, things are changing now. Things have been such that there are disease conditions which cannot just rely on RCTs, because for example in some one of the slides I'll show you that for example conditions like rare cancers that are there, or something rare genomic diseases that are there, you can't find enough number of patients in order to do an RCT, because patient population would be some might be in the US, some in India, some might be in some other part of the world. So getting that patient population together would be very difficult in one place in order to do any study, or an RCT itself would not be possible. So in that case, the real world evidence forms the basis in order to gather evidence, and then based on that, supplemented by a small trial or a RCT, would help in securing approval from institutions like FDA.
Thank you, sir. Another question from Dr. Indira Parab. Is the consent collected from the patient involved in RWE, and any regulatory or ethical committee panel approval to start with RWE?
Right. So again, as I said, RWE can be, it's very very vast, right? So when the data is coming from claims analysis, or when the data is coming from insurances, then there's no consent that is required, because as I said before, the patient data is de-identified. It is anonymized. So there is no patient information to get to know who's the patient. So there's no requirement of providing consent. However, if a survey is being done, or if there is any uh, uh, other sources like registries, then that is a place where you would have an institutional review board committee that approves and make sure that you have the patient consent before anything can be done. At the same time, when you have these apps on the mobile where they say that why don't you store your information in this app regarding your blood tests, your pharmacy records. So they uh, at the first shot itself, they would take your consent that you are ready to share this information with someone. So that is the type of consent that is required when you are sharing the data. But if it's as I said before, if it's something specific where it is a survey, where or a prospective study that is being planned, then that time of consent is definitely taken, and a proper review board and a review approval is required. Any other questions?
Yes, sir. Just one question from Shivaji Manohar Giram, sir. How to analyze vast data obtained from RWE?
Oh, wow, that's $1 million question, actually. And that's again, so that's a part of HEOR and RWE training. So That's what we as HEOR professionals are trained as when we join the health economics outcomes courses. Is that how do you analyze this big data? What are the tools that are required to analyze this big data? So at the same time, it's not just about using any tool like SAS, R, Python to just get the data and find the means, medians, mode, standard deviation. It's not just about that, but then what effective methods that you can do in order to get things at the level where you want it to be. For example, as I said, the RWE data would be heterogeneous when you are comparing the groups. You first want to make sure that your groups are not heterogeneous so that the effect that you see in your product is just because of the product and not because of anything else that's been happening to these patients. So these are some of the considerations that have to be taken into place before you can analyze. But of course, to make it short, there are tools to analyze this data, and you have to be trained on those uh, uh, to answer or analyze these big data. Anything else before we
So can we
move
take
on?
one more question?
Yes, sure.
There is another question from Sneha Bagle, madam. How long will the data be collected for RWE till the patent for the drug expires? What is the target for RWE?
That's a very good question. So RWE, so for example, I keep on going back to this insurance data because that forms the major bulk of what the RWE research, or that's the most simplest way of getting the data. So the insurance data or the electronic health records, it doesn't stop, right? You do not stop. The hospitals get this data continuously, so you do not stop anywhere to get that data. Now it will depend on the researcher what is their aim and what is their objective and hypothesis when using this data. So for example, I have a new drug that is going to be launched next year. So now what is my aim? My aim is to use this RWE data that is available before the launch of the drug and to create noise and create awareness about the unmet need or the gaps that is there in the therapeutic area, and show that our drug through clinical trials is going to fulfill that gap. So I'm going to use the RWE to show that in the real world settings, patients have been very dissatisfied with the treatment options that are available. Patients incur very high cost burdens. And here is a solution to it. We have a drug that is going to be launched next year, and this drug is going to be reducing the healthcare burden, or this drug is going to be providing improvement. So with RWE, it depends upon the source of the data that you are looking at. With registries, definitely you don't want to be paying for following patients for just extended period of times. You want to know what your objectives are and decide on the time frame when to stop following these patients and obtain that data and stop that registry. But with insurances and with the electronic health records, the data is available. Again, it depends what contracting you have with those institutions in order to obtain that data.
Thank you, sir. I request you to continue with the presentation.
Sure, and thank you for all those questions. It helps me a lot. So again, I'll quickly walk through this. Here are the advantages of RWE. So we know that randomization has its magic, because with randomization, as I was saying, the two groups that we compare are exactly the same, and therefore we can say that the drug is efficacious. But however, what happens is with with randomized controlled trials, we have a small population. So, and that's the example with what I'm quoting here is the RCTs involving patients with cancer would represent just less than 5% of the US adults with cancer. So are we saying that these 5% of the sample is representative of all the adult patients with cancer? Probably not. The patients that are available, or the patients that are there in real world, or the patients that are there, the 95% of patients could be different than these 5% of patients that the RCT chooses, because RCT has a lot of inclusion and exclusion criteria. Again, the patients with in RCTs could also be younger, they could be healthier than what we see with the 95% of patients with cancer. So, because it's not always feasible to conduct an RCT, particularly among patients with rare cancers or genomic subtypes, as I was mentioning before, the Food and the Drug Administration has accepted RWE for expanded access studies, medical records, and with these insurance claims. So, these RWE, they form as a supplement, or they complement the RCTs that are done. However, again, a few more examples here. The same things as I was saying before. RCTs offers, or they are supplements and complements to the RWE is it supplements and complements to the RCTs that is there. However, we must understand that it is not that we want to make a choice of one over the other. It has to be that RCTs form a gold standard, and then RWE could supplement and complement the RCTs. And in case when RCTs become very difficult, a valuable piece of information could be provided by RWE as well. Then going to the limitations of RWE, and some of them, as Dr. Shide was talking about, was the data quality management. So we need to make sure that the data that we get from our RWE is of good quality. We need to make sure. Otherwise, if you garbage in, you're going to get is the garbage out. You're not going to get any quality information from that data. So what is important is how that study is designed and conducted. In order, when you look at the conclusion, you want to be you want to see is what's the rigor in the RWE when it was conducted. Then, as someone was asking before, with respect to the analysis of massive amount of data, so you need that experience, you need those experts in order to make sure that you can handle the massive data correctly. You want to make sure that you are comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. And again, as we were talking, privacy, confidentiality, loss of data is a big concern there. You want to make sure that the data is de-identified before it can be analyzed. Otherwise, it could fall in wrong hands, and it could lead to a lot of issues later. Again, the standardized research protocols need to be established, because we want to make sure that we have a set protocol that is being used, and not keep on tweaking things as the researcher wants. So a priori, you want to have what the research question is before you can conduct the analysis, and want to make sure again that you interpret the bias that the RWE gets into the picture when you are interpreting the data. Finally, again, before we move on to HEOR, I want to say that no causation can be done with RWE. There are methods that are leaning towards causation, but a normal RWE study is always going to say, or when you read research articles using RWE, it's always going to talk about association rather than causation. Anything before we move on to the complexity of the healthcare and decision making becoming complex and getting HEOR into picture?
Abhishek, I don't know whether it is too early to ask this question, but since you mentioned that it can give you the information about your about with the unmet needs, and accordingly you can make noise about the product when you're launching it. So I would like to know what is the exact objective of HEOR.
Right. So that is a very good question, and again, I will be talking about that in my coming slides as well. So HEOR is a field that helps you make informed decision. And Chide ma'am, that's a very good segue into what I'm going to be talking. So I'll take your question as I'm walking through this slide. So now in today's world, we see that the healthcare ecosystem is under immense pressure. You have limited resources. With COVID taking coming into play, you have very limited resources that you want to deal with or you want to use amongst the huge patient population. The innovative treatments are being developed, and now you have precision medicine, personalized medicine. So now that is complicating the situation. Is it that the precision personalized medicine, when you say that you get little benefit with it, and from whose perspective are you talking about that little benefit? So but that little benefit comes with a huge cost. Are you ready to spend that much amount of money for that little benefit that you get from these innovative treatments? So now the healthcare system is under immense pressure making this decision. Is that novel system worth the money that we are ready to spend on it? So now, how do you take this decision? These decisions can't be taken over, a spur of a moment, saying that no, it looks that there is a benefit. Let's just pay whatever amount the pharmaceutical company is asking for. But again, now it complexes the situation further. The benefit, whose benefit are you talking about? Are you talking the benefit from the patient side? So the patient may say, yes, if it improves my quality of life, if I am able to walk for 1 day a week with this drug, I am ready to spend all the money that is required. But now there is another layer to it. There is patients, they are payers. So in the countries where you have most of the patients with insurance, it is not the patient who's making the payment, but it is the insurance who's going to be making the payment. Now it is from the payer's perspective. The patient is saying he's ready to pay, but that walking skill or that patient getting to walk at least for few hours, how much is it important from the payer? Is the payer benefiting anything from that? Is it going to be reducing their healthcare resource utilization? Is it reducing their number of medications that the patient is going to be taking? Is it going to be reducing their hospitalization? If yes, the payer would be interested. If not, the payer would not deem those things that the patient is saying important is important from their side. Now there are providers again. The providers would have different perspective, and then you have to look from the society as a whole. How is it benefiting the society? So based on these, HEOR comes into play and provides the tools that are required in order to make these logical or make informed decision based on the data that's available. So when I say these tools, so what are these tools that the HEOR has, or what are the tools that the HEOR uses, is what I would be talking in these slides as well. So HEOR is going to help show the value of the product and get all the scenarios in front of the payers, the providers, and then it will, along with the RCT data that is coming to the FDA. So what we should understand as such is, when a drug is approved, there are two layers. One is approval from the regulatory perspective, that the drug is efficacious, the drug gets approved, it is going to benefit the patient. But are the insurance ready to cover that drug? If you have a drug that's approved by FDA, but all the insurance companies say that no, we are not ready to cover this drug and provide access to the drug, the patient pays all the money out of pocket. So for a pack, which is for a pack of, say, a 14-day course, if I have to spend something like $8,000 from my pocket. Are the patients ready to spend that much amount out of pocket? The patient would say, no, I do not want to take a $8,000 14-day course. I am ready to take $1 pill and ready to go with a 20-day course rather than spending that $5,000 or $8,000 treatment. Now the pharmaceutical industry is at loss because they never got approvals or they never got the insurance to cover their prices. So this is what HEOR is going to help them understand the benefits or the value of the drug products to both the payers, the providers, the patients, and then uh, I wouldn't say lobby it, but going to pressure in order to get approvals from all of these so that the patient in the end benefits and gets access to these drugs. Madam, does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, very much.
Thank you. So, what is happening is, as I say in this, the decision making in healthcare is becoming very complex because of these innovative treatment coming into picture. And then you have uh, further other aspects which are very important with healthcare equity. When you say healthcare equity, you want to make sure that everyone gets the treatment. It is not only the rich class getting the treatment and the poor class does not cannot afford those treatment and therefore cannot get that treatment. So you want to make sure that the access to the drug is throughout and is available to all. So you want the effort everywhere is to get these drugs approved by the insurances or by the national or the public uh, sectors so that the drug is available to the public, and that makes the decisions very challenging. And that's where the HEOR tools come into play, or the HEOR team helps with making these decisions. So when we say HEOR, so as everyone knows, HEOR is health economics outcomes research, but it is actually two different fields that are coming together to provide this powerful data in order for the healthcare decision makers to make these decisions. So what is health economics? Economics, as you know, involves cost. So what it does, it measures the value of the outcomes that you are going to get. So if you say that a certain product is going to reduce my hospitalization by X number, so what is the value of that? What is the dollar amount that you can give it to that? Reduction in the hospitalization means $20,000 less. Similarly, you look at what's the value associated with each of the outcomes that you are looking at, and that goes in hand with the outcomes that you are looking at. So when you are saying outcome research, it is evaluating what are the outcomes that you are looking at, what are the endpoints you are looking at because of the intervention. Are you comparing the interventions A versus B, or you are comparing interventions A versus a placebo? And then from what perspective are you looking at? And again, that perspective means, are you looking at from a clinical perspective, are you looking at from the economic perspective, or are you looking at from an humanistic perspective? So that's all what is very important when you are talking about this. So further to talk about outcome research, again, as I said, clinical endpoints, economic endpoints, humanistic endpoints, these are the ones that the outcomes research is going to be evaluated. And then when you are doing any kind of outcomes research, you need to have a basic concept. What what do you want to evaluate and why do you want to evaluate? You can't just say that I want to say see X versus Y because I think there would be something between the two. No, you need to have a concept of why you think you want to evaluate the results of something. Again, when you are talking about outcomes research, it does not mean one field. It could include epidemiologic research, it could include real world analysis, it could include patient reported outcomes, clinical studies, systematic reviews, meta-analysis. So it includes a vast area of things that come into the outcomes research. Therefore, what happens is when you have outcomes research and health economics come together, which is again, it forms a really vast field that evaluates how a drug is performing and then provide tools for decision making to the agencies that evaluate the technology, the healthcare technology. So before we move on to the next section, which is on the value demonstration strategy, I'm going to take a pause and see if there are any questions.
So, Abhishek, that means health economics is talking about um, the saving because of reduction in the hospitalization or something of that sort. But outcome research is focusing on effect of healthcare intervention on patient in terms of humanistic advantages or clinical advantages. Is it like that? Have I understood it correctly?
Right, but then you can't separate. Usually, you do not separate one from the other. But your understanding is correct. When you say health economics, it is going to look at measuring the value that's associated with the outcomes that you would get from an intervention, right? But then, when you are looking at the outcomes, how are you going to get that outcomes? You are going to get that outcomes from the outcomes research field, right? So that's where the outcomes research field comes into play. And then the two are, that's the way the two come together. But when you are actually talking about outcomes research, it does mean the same way. You are going to look at the clinical outcomes. How is the drug performing when you're looking at, are the death rate different between the two products that you are looking? Is the disease, is the patient going to be in the remission, or the disease is going to be relapsing later when you take a drug? When you're talking about the economic outcomes, as you said correctly, it is going to be like the cost reduction that's going to be happening, or lower number of hospitalization that's going to be happening. Then humanistic is about the quality of life, how much disability that you would face if you would not take the drug, or if you would take a drug versus the drug B.
And so, oh, for outcome research, your tools are these real world evidences, and is it so? From there, you
Right.
are
So
going to get the
in
data.
order to do outcomes research, you do use real world evidence, real world analytics, the real world data that comes into picture. Yes, that is very correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
Hello. I want to ask a question.
sure.
Uh,
Please go ahead.
this may seem a little foolish to you, but I wanted to ask this question. The way you gave an example of $1 pill per day, uh, as opposed to some $8,000 treatment. So, can I also conclude that because of health economics, some better treatments may be sidelined, and if they are sidelined, how can they be made economical?
Right. So I want to understand your question again. So yes, so there could be examples where you have $1 versus $8,000 treatments. So when you ask this, the treatments are sidelined. So when you say that, what do you mean exactly? So do you mean that the $8,000
And
treatment
the
is
treatment
sidelined?
may be better, may reduce the disability to say example 80-90%. And $1 treatment may not reduce disability to a greater extent. So $8,000 treatment is better. But since it is not economic, the patient is forced to take $1 pill treatment every day. So
Right.
how do you adjust this economics? How do you make that $8,000 treatment economical?
So that's the whole game of health economics outcomes research, right? And that again depends upon who, how not FDA, but the insurance companies and these payers, how do they consider all of these? So what we want to see is we want to have a package to the payers such that they believe and see the rigor that this treatment brings, or the improvements that they bring in the patient's life are very important, and that's going to be helping them reduce the cost for reduce the cost on other grounds if they approve this treatment. So what we want to do is, with health economics outcomes research, is we show them a scenario over maybe 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, and say that if you use this new treatment A versus this $1 treatment, look at the cost savings that you would have over 5 years. Maybe initially you wouldn't see that, but over the 5 year period, this treatment is going to be cost effective. So that's something that you would want to say. And again, there are other tools. So cost is not only one factor. What you have to do with health economics. So there are studies or modeling studies where that's a part, again, a bread and butter of my job is the cost effectiveness modeling, where what you do is you have cost on one hand, the numerator is the cost, and effectiveness is your denominator. So what you see is how much of the increase in the cost divided by the increase in the quality of the life that you gain from the novel treatment as compared to the old treatment. Then you have that which is called as the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, ICER, which we call it to be. We look at that ICER, and that ICER is checked against a particular mark, which is willingness to pay. And I did not want to get into all the technical details, but you have that tool, you compare it with that, and then you are trying to convince the payer and prove to them how your treatment is going to be beneficial to the patient and being economic.
Okay, thank you.
And I know that we started maybe 1 year back, 1 hour back, and I don't know what's the break time, if you want to take a break versus how does that work?
No.
I think you can continue. Only thing is with Q&A, if we could complete by 9, then that would be great. Because,
Okay.
with Q&A, question and answers discussion.
Okay, that sounds good. And I will tell me if I have to go fast over certain slides, I'll do that as well.
Now you
I'm
can.
just-
Because, now we all have understood the concept. Now you can now take a page. Yes.
Okay, sure. Okay, so then what do I do, or what does HEOR does when we are doing any kind of study? So what are these tools that we have been talking about, or what is the items that HEOR looks at? And that is what we do is the strategy development or the value strategy development, which we call it to be the HEOR value demonstration strategy. The objectives here are to use is the clinical data. So the first, whatever you see on the left, the green column is taking the clinical information or the clinical program progress, which is from the RCTs, taking it, using it, and then developing value messages based on what we find in the clinical trials, going through a lot of gap analysis, understanding what's the burden of disease, what's the unmet need, and then applying, looking at the clinical, humanistic, economic value for the outcomes, and then changing the messages based on who the stakeholders are, and then providing communication tools to our cross-functional colleagues so that can give them talking points and that can help them make that conversations with their stakeholders when they go outside in the field. So when I say this value demonstration strategy, it is nothing but we want to have is a value story for our product. And where do you begin with? So as what we would do with our dissertations or thesis writing, the first step that we do is literature review, and that's what we would do as well. We would do is a literature review. This could be something which could be a systematic literature review or a targeted literature review. Systematic is something that you can reproduce again if you give your key strings. Targeted is where you do not have something specific or a specific criteria that you follow. It's just based on what your research objectives are, and then you include things. So what I believe, what I did back in India with my thesis for masters was a targeted literature review, whereas there are thesis dissertations that could be solely on systematic literature reviews as well, and could have a lot of rigor in there. So the first step is literature review. Why do we do that? Just to understand what's the market landscape. So what are our competitors doing? What's available? What is not available? So that leads us to the gap assessment. So we would look at the four quadrants, which we call it to be the SWOT analysis, where we look at the strengths, opportunities, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and the threats for our product, and then make an elaborate list of things that we can address. So that helps us make a value proposition for our product. So what does a value proposition of a product mean? So a value proposition of a product, it could be as simple as we could have a one-liner elevator pitch where we say that, oh, we have a 2-week treatment that acts really fast, sustained action, and helps patients uh, get into remission state, response state as fast as possible. And then we have corresponding messages to prove what we said. And then the studies that are required for that. So that's what a value proposition is that we want to develop. And then, in order to support that value proposition, we want to look at what is the evidence or what are the studies that are available and what additional studies we need to generate from these. So that's what a value demonstration strategy factors or keys would look at. So, as I said, for a particular drug launch, what is important is to have that value story. Without a story, no payer is going to accept what you want to put in the market. The payers are always going to say that when you have a $1 treatment, why do you want to have is an expensive $8,000, $5,000 treatment? You want to be able to justify what's your value story. You need to be able to provide first an elevator pitch. What is that this product will provide to the patient? And then based on that elevator pitch, you have is your claims or pillars that support what you have said. So the first thing or the pillars that we have is the burden of disease. You definitely want to show what is the burden of the disease that you are looking at. Then you want to show is what is the unmet need or what is something that the standard of care is not able to achieve. You want to show is the clinical benefits or the efficacy and the safety, most of which will come from your clinical trials. You have is the humanistic and the societal benefits, followed by your economic benefits. So this usually form or is a toolkit that the HEOR has, and you want to see is how much of these you can fit in or how much of this you can prove so that your message becomes stronger and something that the stakeholders, the payers or the providers are going to believe and are going to approve or provide access to your treatment that's in question. So now I go on to the examples that we have and show you what exactly do we do. And each of these examples are nothing but individual studies in order to get out the message to the payer. So on these studies, I would show not the name of the disease because it's proprietary and confidential information for Biogen. So I have removed the names of the disease or the drug wherever possible and have mentioned it as drug X or drug Y that I would be showing in these examples. So the first thing that I said, one of the main pillar or the main background that forms is the burden of illness. So you want to understand and want to show the payers that the burden of disease has been increasing over years. So this information could already be available in the literature. If the information for your specific disease population is not available, then how do you conduct this study? So then for that, again, you go to the real world data, you would look at the claims information, you would look at the national surveys that are conducted, you would look at the electronic health records that are done. And then you would do a simple analysis where you show what has been happening with the incidence of this disease over the years. So it could be as simple as what you see in this graph, where you see is 28% increase in the disease and 15% increase in the drug use. So we see that in this disease area, not only is the disease incidence increasing, but there is increase in the drug use as well. So here our stakeholders get to know that there is an increase and there is a demand for this drug use. We further go and then we want to make sure that the message is subtly understood and is good and catchy enough so that the stakeholders understand again this. So then as you see that 1 in 5 adults in the US experience this disease at some point in time. So again, that shows how important, how the gravity or how serious this disease condition is for these patients. In this burden of disease, not only is the just the incidence is important, or what we say is the gravity that is important, but finally when it comes to the payers, you want to show is the dollar amounts as well. Everything that you do with the payers, you want to show is the dollar amount. With the providers, you want to show from the patient perspective how it is benefiting. So definitely you want to show the payers that in 2010, what was the amount of expenditure that was spent on this disease versus what does the scenario look present or from where the data is available. Again, as I say, this could be a very complex study, but the final result that you see is a simple bar chart where you just see some numbers and is easy for the payers to understand. But what is important, again, as an HEOR professional, is how this study is done. So there are a lot of technical details that may go behind the scene, but when you go on to showcasing it to your stakeholders, you want the message to be as crisp and clear as possible, and you want it to be as simple as possible as well. If the information is required, you need to have it available how the analysis was done. Again, you want to be current with what's happening today as well. So you do not want to miss on the opportunity what COVID brings to the table and how it has affected this disease condition before COVID and after COVID. So again, as we see here, with pre-pandemic, the disease condition was 6.5%, which goes on to show it to be 22.4% after COVID. Again, for this, we had to use a data that provided information pre-COVID and post-COVID. One thing that we want to keep in mind is whenever you are looking for real world evidence data, there is always a lag time from when you will get the data. So for example, the hospitals might be recording the data for the patient today, but we would not get that data in order to analyze maybe for next 6 months, because it has to undergo through different quality checks, it has to be anonymized, it has to be de-identified, it has to go through various steps before it can get to an HEOR professional who can analyze the data and look at it. So it is very important to see when the data is available, what the data sources could be, and are the data sources such that you can trust that data. So this is one aspect that I showed. Another thing is the economic burden. So the first economic burden that I showed was in general with respect to the hospitalization, the inpatient use, and that forms the direct cost. But there might be more cost that would be associated uh, apart from the direct medical healthcare cost, which could be the workplace cost, and we want to capture as many economic benefits because of the drug that can help us get our drug in the formulary. So we do not want to miss on the indirect cost which could come from this workplace cost. And when I say workplace cost, what does it mean? Because of this disease condition, the patient may lose or patient may not go to work for a certain number of days. The patient may go to work but may not be attentive enough that he can be productive in order to give the same efficiency as someone without a disease condition. So we want to adjust and we want to account for all those and show the totality of evidence when we are talking about the cost burden. And that's what this economic burden of disease study does, is to show us the overall burden that was there in 2010 versus 2018. And these are just years that we have chosen. It could be any years that we want to show, but definitely you would want to focus on the cost increase because of this disease. And to make sure, at this stage I'm not even talking about the drug that is going to be coming in the market. At this stage I'm just talking about the burden of the disease and the cost increase that is happening because of the increased incidence of this disease. Here what we are doing is we are trying to show is the blue, green, and the dark blue columns at the end show the payer types. So in the United States, you would have three major payer types: the commercial insurance, the Medicare, which is the 65 plus insurance, which is a government insurance, and the Medicaid insurance, which is especially for the poor who have income below a certain level. So we want to show that how is that disease burden across all these three payer kinds, so that the payers or the stakeholders, the providers, understand how it is affecting the different sectors as well. So before I go on to the unmet need, I want to see if there is any question here. Okay.
Just a small question. What's the difference between provider and payer?
Okay, so the when we say provider, it is the healthcare provider. So the healthcare provider could be a hospital, or it could be a healthcare practitioner. Basically, it could be a physician, a doctor, or the hospital unit as a whole. But when we talk about a payer are basically these insurance companies that would be paying for your drug costs or your medical costs.
Yes, yes, I got it. Sorry.
So now what we want to do, the next bucket or the next pillar is that of the unmet need. So now we want to slowly get our drug into picture. So we first showed that the disease burden is increasing. Now what's happening with the standard of care that is already available? And this is something which is called as the Sankey diagram, which shows the flow of the patients that move from one treatment to another. And as you see that there is a lot of movement that is happening in these graphs. I don't want you to understand anything with these graphs, but I want you to just see the flow of things for these patients, or the patient journey that is happening in this disease condition. So what we want to focus here is that the number of patients that switch therapy in the study period. So we want to show that the patients are switching therapy quickly. The patients are not remaining on one therapy. The patients are discontinuing treatment. What does it show? that the patients are not satisfied. The patient are not getting the kind of treatment that they want from the current standard of care. So that brings us to a dialogue with our stakeholders saying that there is a need for this novel treatment to get into market, which will help the patient very early on and be on the treatment for a longer duration of time, rather than switching and trying to find the right treatment that works for them. Again, this is a very complicated study, but right now what you see is a very simple message where you see is the switching patterns of the patients. And again, this is using real world data, using the claims or the administrative claims analysis from insurances. So another thing with the standard of care that we focus on, and these are just example, this is not the entire thing. These are just some of the important snippets that I want you to understand when we are conducting HEOR studies, what we do. This is about the tolerability profile of the SOC. The SOC is nothing but standard of care that we want to showcase, or we want to show how many patients undergo through these poor tolerability of the drug. So as what you see with these bar charts, that 74% of the patients have withdrawal symptoms, sexual difficulties, weight gain, drowsiness, agitation, which shows and tells a story that the current standard of care lacks the safety profile that is required from this in this disease area from a drug. The next important thing that the stakeholders, usually the payers, are important is adherence to the treatment and the persistence. When you say adherence to the treatment is how much are you how willing are you to take this medication every day, or are you skipping these medications and just relying that it's fine if I do not take this medication for 2 days and I will still receive that benefit. If there is poor adherence to the treatment, the outcomes that we see are going to be poor as well, because in randomized controlled trials, it's a controlled setting, so everything is fixed. Maybe the adherence there to the treatment is really very high, whereas here what we see is that the adherence is very low, and therefore what we can conclude is that patients that as they move through the time periods, the adherence by the end of 12 months is just 21%. That is, only 21% of the patients are taking medications regularly. Rest of the patients are not taking their medications regularly, and there could be various reasons. The other graph to the right, which shows is the persistent, is how continuously are you taking the medications? Are you stopping these medications in between? And that's what it shows. The red line that you see there on that, it shows a drastic drop at day 30, which means by day 30, the patients are discontinuing their treatment. They are not remaining persistent, and it depends how you define persistence again. So they might not be persistent on their treatment. They might be discontinuing, they might be switching their treatment. But what we see with these treatments is that there is poor persistence with this treatment. And these are the graphs, these proportionality tools that we have are really helpful for the stakeholders to understand what is happening currently in this disease situation and what's the unmet need, and understand the gap in this disease area. So again, once we do all this analysis, how do you tie this together, at least with the standard of care? So you want to have a catchy messages where payers can quickly see, because they may not have the time, or they may not have that expertise to understand what those graphs actually mean. So in order for them to understand that, and this is true with any of the research that we do, we want to make sure that our messages are as clear as possible. So here what we are trying to do is, we are trying to show is what are the treatment outcomes when the patient is on standard of care drug treatment, where we say 2 of the 3 patients failed to achieve remission with the first line therapy. They were never able to remit, so they switched on to some other treatment. It took 4 to 8 weeks for these patients to show some response to the standard of therapy. So for 4 to 8 weeks, the patient did not show response to the treatment and were still suffering before the treatment could kick in the effect. 83% of the patients underwent a treatment change over a 12-month period time. That's a big proportion of patients that underwent a treatment change in that short period of time of 12 months. So again, these messages are really very bold and help the payer to understand the gravity of the unmet need in this disease area. Again, what we are focusing here, and this is one again example, is the drug that we would be launching in the market is going to have is support early remission, and then therefore we want to show is what are the benefits when the patients experience early remission. We want to show is that if patients have early remission, then it's going to be in the downstream, it is going to be beneficial for these patients versus those patients who do not have early remissions. So it may take, like for example, as what you see, without early remissions, the patient take up to 1 year to regain average normal functioning. So these are some of the messages that we want to convey and make the stakeholder understand the gravity of the situation. So again, when we are talking, we spoke about the cost piece, we spoke about the adherence piece, but we want to again make sure that we are not missing on the minute things as well. So we want to make sure that we are showing them a full picture. So we want to make sure that we show the multidimensional burden of disease that is there because of this disease condition, which could be suicidal ideation, physical manifestation, cognitive dysfunction, increased risk of comorbidities, mood impairments. And to support all these messages, we would have to conduct studies in order to show each of these messages. So these studies go in the background, and we would have one message per study that shows this. And again, there are methods that are used in order to get these messages out. You can't just use RWE and say that I want to show suicidal ideation with RWE. You have to find the right data source, would have the right variable, and do the right kind of study design method vigor in order to prove these analysis. So before I go on to the target drug clinical program, I would want to see is if there are any other questions. Okay. So with the target drug clinical development program, this is nothing but our clinical trials. So from the clinical trials, what we are going to take is we are going to look at what improvements does the drug show. If there are 2 or 3 trials, the HEOR team, what it would do is it would combine these 3 trials in order to show added benefits that we could get from pooling the data together. Or what we can do is we can look at the comparison between the drugs that are used in the trials, which we call it to be the indirect treatment comparisons. So for example, in the trial, clinical trial or the RCT, if we compare the drug versus placebo, but now there was no standard of care that was used in the RCT. What we want to see is how does this drug compare against the standard of care, which could be another drug, instead of looking at the placebo. The RCT did not do that. So there are ways in which you can do that indirect treatment comparison. So that's what a HEOR team is going to come into picture and going to help design a study that would make that comparison between uh, the drug of interest and the standard of care as well. And again, there are methods in order to do that. As we were looking at this before, we created an unmet need where we saw that the discontinuation with the standard of care was really high. Here we show that with our drug, the discontinuation rate is really low. So that again gives a very positive message that if you use this novel treatment, the discontinuation of the treatment is very low. If the drug is already in the market, then still, when you do this research, you can still prove that in the real world settings, what we see is that with our treatment, we see that the discontinuation rates with our drug has been considerably lower as compared to what we see with any other drug. The economic value, this is the most important piece of our research, and that's where all the teams have their eyes and rely on us when it comes on the economic value. So with economic value, what we want to show is, the first thing is, with standard of care, how much is the cost versus with our drug, how much is the cost, and show that dollar amount a reduction in the medical cost versus the standard of care. So RCTs are not going to be providing that number. This is only through real world evidence that we can get these numbers. Again, we want to make sure that when we are comparing patients for standard of care and for our drug, we want to compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges. So we want to make sure that the patients that we include in the standard of care and the drug of interest are similar in all the characteristics that we look at, like the age, gender, the comorbidities, the insurance that they have, and any other conditions that would affect this outcome of interest. So how do we make sure? There are methods like propensity score matching, instrumental variables, and so on that help us get these patients at the same level. Again, so when we are talking with the payers, we are not just talking what is the annual cost, or we want to talk is PPY, which is per patient per year cost. That's the way the costs are presented. It could be per patient per month cost as well, or it could be per patient per year cost. But then you would want to again double click on these costs and show exactly where are these costs coming from. Are these coming from the inpatient settings? Are these coming from the outpatient settings? Are these coming from the ED, which is the emergency settings? And are these differences statistically significant as well? This is the most important part of HEOR, where we want to show that our drug is cost effective option for patients with this disease. Especially, so in the US payers do not give much focus on the cost effectiveness analysis, whereas there are other countries like UK, they predominantly look at what is this cost effectiveness model showing and the rigor of this cost effectiveness model. So we as companies would provide our cost effectiveness model and put it in the public domain, and then the nice organization is going to critique it, and they are going to tell us whether the rigor that we used in developing this cost effectiveness model to show that the drug under consideration is cost effective is really good or no. If they are very critical and they say that they do not believe the result, it affects the reimbursement. And UK being a very influential country, it affects the decisions that are taken by other European countries as well with respect to the decision making. So we have to take into consideration which countries and what is important for which country. For example, France and Germany, They would want to look at the efficacy of the drug along with the cost effectiveness as well. So, but quality of life is also important for them. So what should be our focus when we are delivering this result is very important for us. Then there is something which is called as the budget impact model or the budget impact. What this means or what this tool provides is it helps one to understand if you get this new treatment into market, how much is the budget going to be affected because of addition of this new drug into the formulary. And when I say formulary, these is something which is being reimbursed by the insurance. So if the insurance adds this new drug into their budget and they say that they are ready to cover the cost of this drug for the patient, how much incremental cost does this add to the budget that the insurance has to undergo? And that again, the companies have to be very uh, they need to think through the process before they can even get to this budget impact model. Is what are the costs that we are showing, what are the cost benefits that we are showing, what are the cost offsets that would happen because of the introduction of this drug. And then the payer, it needs to be simple enough for the payer to understand as well what how the budget is being impacted. So what we want to show is that you cannot say that, oh, this new drug is not going to affect your budget at all, it's not going to, but you want to show that the budget that is affected because, or the budget that is going to be influenced or changed because of the new drug is predictable. It is not going beyond a certain value, it is ranging from one value to another. In addition to that, what we want to show to the payers and to our stakeholders, which would be clinicians, is what are the added benefits of this new product? What about the unemployment benefit? What about absenteeism? What about presenteeism? If suicide is important, how much does it affect that? And then provide is the dollar amount from the societal perspective to this. So in the US, humanistic value, the stakeholders would not provide or give more importance, especially the payers, to the humanistic value. But from the European side or for the European countries, this is a crux when you are submitting your package for reimbursement. And that's what you want to show. So what includes in the humanistic value? Humanistic value is not just caring about yourself, but a caregiver that is required. How many hours that a caregiver is putting into uh, caring for this individual who has this disease. So that is very important as well. Along with that, the other humanistic values that could be important would be is the marital status of these patients because of the disease. Are they undergoing any marital separations? The deaths that would be including suicides, unemployed individuals, years of lost education. This year again, we are talking about something with respect to the generational burden of disease. Again, this falls under the humanistic value, where we want to show that the disease not only affects the person, but their child. So what is happening to the child of a parent with disease X who's taking the drug Y versus the drug that is under treatment? So is it reducing that disease burden or the generational burden with the new drug? So this all forms the entirety, or this forms the package for a value demonstration strategy or a value story of a drug from the HEOR perspective. And before I am going to switch gears to medical devices, I'm going to see if there are questions. For medical devices, I know that we don't have much time. I'll quickly walk you through this. Uh, but before that, I want to make sure that you don't have any questions, or if you have questions, we can go through them quickly. Okay. I believe there are no questions, so let's go ahead. So with why am I talking about medical devices now and future of RWE? Medical devices are at that stage where things are really changing with medical devices. And why do I say that? Because now with medical devices, the current scenario for medical devices is that they are static. The device that is implanted in heart, or if you have a nail in your body, that doesn't provide any information outside once it is in the body. Where they want to change is they want to make these devices now very intelligent, that and smart, so that they can provide information in spite of being inside the body. So they want to reinvent things. They want to reposition stuff. When we say reposition, it's because companies like Google are entering into medical devices. So now the companies that are already doing it, they want to restructure and make sure that they are in the competition along with these big giants like Google. Reconfigure. So when you say reconfigure, with reinvention and reposition, you want to see is who are you, who's your target audience. Initially, the target audience for the medical device or for drug industry was just the physicians. Now it is not the physicians, but you can cater to the patients directly, and the patients can demand what kind of medical device you want. So all this leads to the future of medical devices. So now, for example, here what we are seeing is an inhaler which could be connected to a health app. So it could be a health app that could be on your mobile, and the minute you use this inhaler, the inhaler sends signal to your medical device or to your mobile phone, which records what time of the day did you take this inhalation, or what time of the day it was used, what were the surroundings around that was used. So this helps not only the patient to understand if he wants to see when things were skipped or when things were taken, but for a doctor to understand the pattern in which this medication was used. If there is an adverse outcome that is coming out, doctor would understand that, oh, the medication was missed for last 5 days, and therefore the patient is suffering through it. Another example could be these apps that are coming, which are taking information from various sources. As I was saying, the variables that you have on your hands, the weather reports, the medical records, the diagnostic results, everything could be combined into one, and logical conclusions could be made through these real world analytical tools in order to understand what exactly is contributing to these changes that are happening. Suddenly someone is getting an heart attack. What are the things that are responsible, or what are the things that may contribute to this adverse event that a patient has? This ECG band a patient may wear, and if there is something it detects abnormal, could send a signal to the physician. The physician understands it immediately, calls for an ambulance, and the patient could be saved with such devices like this. Accurate imaging and diagnostic. When I say this, what I mean here is we go for all these scanning devices. It is very difficult for a doctor to sometimes just see abnormal patterns in this unless they are really amplified. But the data analytics, real world data, could help that. So you already have data from so many patients before. You can feed that in, and minute differences it can detect. So when a new patient comes in and has the scan done, and if there is abnormality based on what the prior information is, it can quickly inform the doctor that there looks to be an abnormality in the imaging and the diagnostic, and therefore the patient can be alerted that there is some health issue. This example is about robotics. So where is Verily, which is a Google company, what is it trying to do? It is trying to democratize surgery. So the surgeon, maybe in one part of the world, and the robot in the other part who would be doing a surgery. Right now, Johnson and Johnson already and other companies already have robots that do surgery for hips and knees. So they are already in place. But something like this is going to be in real future. And what is it? What is helping this is the real world data that is feeding in, that is helping the physicians understand the patterns and the way things need to be done. Predictive analytics and precision medicine. So here the example that we are talking about is of a stent that is put in the heart after angioplasty. If this stent is intelligent enough, it can detect minor changes in the surroundings. So if there is an embolism, there is an infection, there is a structural defect, it can immediately detect that, send signals outside, let the physician know that there are some abnormalities that are happening, and that data could be very important in order to save the life of the patient. Similarly, what could happen from all this is a lot of data could be generated. The data could be used and trained in a model so that the model can predict for which patient which drug would be useful. It would be helpful in precision medicine as well as understanding the risks of doing a particular surgery. So what I mean here is there are risk calculators. So if you are of certain age, gender, height, weight, what is this going to be helpful is understanding if you do a surgery for knee with all these factors, what is the risk for you to do another surgery or revision within 5 years? So the doctors would understand immediately looking at the patient profile before anything can be done as well. So these all important tools would fall under RWE and RWE analytics. So what we discussed, and I'm sorry that we went fast through the last portion of it, but as we see what RWE and HEOR helps us is to understand and measure this burden of disease, identify gaps, provide most effective interventions. We can facilitate the comparisons between the outcomes that could be achieved through these interventions, and really make sure that the interventions that we are using or the interventions that are got to the market are really worth it. So when we have a private and public payers who are alike on increasing demand of evidence to justify a therapy's effectiveness and value, HEOR and RWE provides a tool for demonstrating the value of this intervention, which is a fundamental pillar of the health. And from the medical device industry, what we have seen is that the winning medical device companies, they will have to invest in the innovative surgical interventions. They would have to get this intelligence, artificial intelligence in their profile, making and sharing it with the patients and the providers from the devices like what we have, the wearables, the smart devices, the apps that are there, the Internet of Things, and cloud-based data analytics. Thank you, and I am ready to take any questions that you have.
So before we take questions, I would just like to summarize your presentation. I take this opportunity to appreciate the effort taken by you for explaining us the concept of real world evidence and health economics outcomes research. The session was very enlightening for us as it was a new topic. The comparison between the real world evidence and the randomized clinical trials, which are used to access the outcomes for pharmaceuticals, advantages and limitations of real world evidence were excellently explained and well understood. Sir, you vividly listed the steps of health economics outcomes research, the value demonstration strategy, and explained the pillars of problem and solution in the value story of new drug. Sir explicitly explained the vital information and tools to healthcare decision makers, from the intervention to the healthcare system, with vivid, distinct examples. Sir also briefly covered the applications of health economics outcomes research in medical devices using smart automated devices. Sir clearly mentioned the few to mention the roles and responsibilities of these HEOR is to help the patient to understand, even if the drug is costly, but it can be effective and improve the quality of patient's life. It also helps in designing the study for comparison of the drug of interest and the standard of care. Sir, the session was very informative and there were lot many things to learn from this session. Thank you very much, sir. I would like to take questions if there are any questions from the participants.
Abhishek, I have one question about the last part that you explained about the smart medical devices. So, if there is a failure of treatment, this can be also due to patient's negligence or he has missed the doses, and your system is able to reveal it. So, whether the payer is going to link it to this kind of behavior and accordingly considering about the support, financial support, or withdrawing the support, any such consequences would be there?
Right. No, that's a very good question. Right now, especially in the United States, the payment happens just based on uh, when the drug or uh, the device is supplied, right? But but there is no talks that are going. What happens if the adherence to this treatment is very low, because of which there are poor outcomes? So even with the medical in the drug industry as well, from the insurance data, we do understand which patient is taking the medication versus which patient is not compliant and adhering to the treatment. But no such penalty or penalization, is being is on the patient at this stage, because then that's going to be adversely affecting the overall healthcare system. But rules change from country to country, right? So we do not know how this information could be used in different countries. But at this stage, there is nothing that puts the patient at risk because of non-adherence or non-compliance to these devices.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
So one questions in the chat box.
Sure.
Sneha Bagle madam is asking, how unbiased is HEOR considering one pharma company which is in competition with the other company?
Right. So you should understand that each HEOR team within a company is going to be working for their product. So, for example, I represent Biogen. So, what my aim would be is to show how the drug that Biogen gets into market would be benefited, and by what uh, showing the totality of evidence that is important from this drug's marketing perspective. So, for example, if my drug is going to be helping the patient within 2 days versus the competitor's drug, which is going to be helping the patient after 2 weeks, my focus through HEOR is going to be highlighting on that point and showcasing that as the prime focus of my results. It doesn't mean that I'm going to be biasing my results, but my focus is going to be that, and my agenda for marketing and commercializing the product is going to be that. That's the strength of my product. Now the same thing that can be done with the competitors market. They would look at what is the additional thing that their drug can do, which the drug here does not do it, and they would focus on that. But in in all this, both of us have to make sure that we are not compromising on the rigor or the quality of the research that is there, and the results are unbiased. So that is what we try and do, is get the most rigorous quality results which would be unbiased in front of the stakeholders.
Thank you, sir, for answering this question. Any more questions, participants?
Uh, One more question I have. When it comes to the provider uh, who is giving a prescription, and then accordingly the insurance company is giving coverage for that prescription. So as a company, after getting the HEOR data, how are you going to sell your product? Are you going to sell it to the provider, or you have to also sell it to the insurance company? Whether both stakeholders should be convinced about, I mean, or just doctors once prescribe your work is over.
No, so that is a very good question. So it doesn't work with just the physicians prescribing it, right? Before it goes to the physician, we want to make sure the first step that happens is the FDA approval. Once FDA approval happens, we want to make sure that the payers are approving and getting our drug on the formulary. So that is the main aim, because even if the physician prescribes the drug and the drug costs $50,000, no patient is going to go and buy that drug for that $50,000 amount, because it is such a huge, enormous amount which no one can afford. They are going to go back to the provider and say that, please change this prescription, I cannot afford it. So we want to make sure that before, as soon as we get that FDA approval, we have insurances covering our product as well and getting that drug on the formulary so that it is covered by them.
And one more last question. I'm
What?
sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions because you made it understood so well by simplifying this concept. It has triggered a lot of queries in the mind. Uh, I just want to know, in India, the still the cost is borne by the patient. But when it comes to application of this knowledge to we people or our students, whether they will be using this for their MNCs if they have to sell the product in the US or European countries, how they would be able to use or apply this kind of knowledge?
Right. So this knowledge especially is helpful. Not so this all comes into play before the drug goes into the generic market, right? So once it is into generic market, it is everywhere, and then you cannot play with the cost piece of it. It is before it is into the generic market that you 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 can do all these kind of studies and create this awareness and provide these tools. So if there are drugs that are not in the generic market and are used in other countries where you have these public payers, most of things have been covered by private insurance, definitely that can be used. But for countries in India, at least at this stage, and that's what uh, hurts me as well, is there are some innovative treatments, but they are very high cost, but are not got into the Indian market because it is not reimbursed. And that's the reason why the Indian patient population cannot take advantage of certain rare disease conditions and the drugs that could be really helpful for them.
Very serious problem indeed. Yes.
Right.
No more question from my end. If others have, please go ahead.
Just check in. No, sir, there are no more questions. So, just one question from my side. What additional qualification, educational qualification is required if we want to get into this HEOR as our job opportunity?
Okay, that is another very good question. So for HEOR, it is very vast, right? So you saw from literature review until the time where you actually develop results for these studies. So you can enter at various levels in this HEOR. So for example, we being trained as pharmacists, we already have the knowledge of pharmacy. We already know how clinical trials work. So medical writing within HEOR is something definitely which is possible and doesn't require additional training, except when it comes to interpreting results that are obtained from these studies. So when you get technical terms like odds ratio, risk ratios, incremental cost effectiveness ratios, and so on within these fields, it becomes very difficult to understand what it means. So for that purposes, maybe you would require training. There are organizations like ISPOR, which is International Society of Outcomes Research, pharmaceutical outcomes research. So those are institutions, non-profit organizations, and they have conferences which help train and give basic knowledge about HEOR and educate and have courses that could help one get into this field. But if you are thinking about doing certain kind of analysis, then maybe you require some kind of professional training in coding. That is important. Uh, and then a master's degree in public health, health service research in HEOR could be another source in order to get into this field.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we would like to felicitate you through this virtual platform with a memento and certificate as a token of our sincere gratitude and congratulate you for the wonderful session. I request our ICT team to play the video, please.
Oh, nice.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, sir, for an informative session and your valuable time. I also take an opportunity to thank AICT ATAL for giving an opportunity to VES College of Pharmacy to organize the faculty development program. Before we close today's session, few announcements for the participants. Kindly fill the feedback
Just a
form.
minute, Aparna madam. I think
Yes, ma'am.
before that, probably Dr. Abhishek will be leaving. So I
Yes.
once again want to thank him on behalf of all of us for making this very difficult to understand topic so easy for all of us and give us lot of general knowledge, increase our awareness about this area. And I'm sure many of us have heard about it for the first time, and it was really very well explained. Thank you very much, Abhishek. Your time, your skills to explain it are just wonderful.
Thank you so much. No, and I really enjoyed, and especially with this audience, and especially Shide ma'am, with you leading this, it was really a lot of fun for me to, walk the audience through this slide. So thank you for giving me this opportunity.
It's our pleasure always. Thank you.
Thank
And I think now you can log out because she's making some announcement for the audience.
Sure.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good
Bye-bye.
day to you. Bye.
Thank you, Abhishek sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Parna madam, sorry to interrupt. You can go ahead
No,
now.
no problem, ma'am. Before we close today's session, few announcements for the participants. Kindly fill the feedback form which is shared in the chat box. Please note the feedback come attendance link will be active today till 10 p.m. Recording of the today's session will be shared by tomorrow. Please join us tomorrow at 6:45 p.m. for day 6 online session on stress management and time management. The session will be delivered by Mr. Apurva Luthia and Mrs. Khushbu Luthia from Twin Light Consultants Private Limited, Mumbai. The joining link will be shared with you all tomorrow. Thank you to all and good night.
I just want to like to add one thing. The organizers have very smartly placed this session at the weekend because this is going to really relieve your stress
Yeah.
whole week. Thank you and good night.